We'll move on now to our last talk of the morning, which is, or not for the morning of this section, which is Spencer Lucas, who's going to be talking about tetrapod biostratigraphy and a whole bunch of other things related to tetrapods. So Spencer.
All right. I'm going to warn you, I've had a little bit of internet instability. Probably Godzilla's doing it. If I disappear, I'll probably come back quickly. We'll see. I want to talk about tetrapod evolution across the Middle Late Pennsylvanian boundary. Really my effort to figure out what happened and was there something big? And of course, if you know what we're talking about, tetrapods are all the vertebrates except what we would call fishes. Next slide. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk. I've divided it into sort of 9 logical parts. And I also want to point out I have a lot of these wonderful pieces of artwork. They come from a really great book by Sebastian Steyer, which had wonderful artwork in it. So I just want to credit that. I'm not much of an artist, so I wouldn't want to pretend I did that. So what I'm going to do is go through these 9 sections or 8 sections, and then at the end, I'm going to try to tell you what I think it all means. Next slide. Well, now, I know that most of you have not had the advantages that I had. I was born a vertebrate paleontologist. That was my original skill set. So I understand a lot about the vertebrate record. So I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to Carboniferous tetrapods. And in my mind, there really are only 4 big groups. The 2 of the groups are classically amphibians, the Lipospondylus and the Temnospondyls. And the Temnospondyls are a really important group of amphibians because they continue to be very diverse and abundant throughout the Permian and even into the Triassic. The 3rd group are a group called reptiliomorphs, which are sort of part reptile, part amphibian. They're the relatives of reptiles, but there's a lot of things about their biology and relationships that are not clear. And then finally, we get to what are now called amniotes. Amniotes are what we all called reptiles forever, but now in a cladistic sense, we divide the amniotes into synapsids and reptiles proper. Okay, so let me talk about each of these groups briefly. Next slide. Lipospondyls are mostly aquatic forms. Some of them are very strange animals, small, and I mean salamander-sized, long, snake-like bodies. Some are thought to have lived on land as snake-like animals. Many of them were clearly aquatic. There's a group I include here called the microsaurs. The microsaurs are a sort of phylogenetic mess right now, but they include some lizard-like forms. So I would say in general, most Lipospondyls are thought to have been aquatic. Maybe a few were terrestrial, small lizard-like or snake-like predators. Next slide. Temnospondyls, as I said, are a big group, and they include a large number of animals that we would call amphibians, but that we think are relatively terrestrial. If you look in the middle there, you see Eriops. This is a very common temnospondyl of the very latest Pennsylvanian and into the early Permian. Big skeleton, big legs, thought to be probably primarily a terrestrial predator. And what's complicated about amphibians, because you're going to see, I'm going to say this, it's really important to decide who's aquatic and who's terrestrial in what I'm talking about. The problem with amphibians is they have essentially 2 lives. That's amphibios, right? And what we've found, what various people have found studying Paleozoic and other fossil amphibians, is there are some amphibians, probably most amphibians, where the younger life stage is aquatic. So you have an aquatic animal that then metamorphoses into a more terrestrial animal. But the reverse also happens. This is what's confusing. There are some of these amphibians where the juveniles look more terrestrial, and then the adult becomes more aquatic. So it's not that easy to simply look at all these Paleozoic tetrapods and know who was aquatic and who was terrestrial throughout the entire life cycle. Next slide. Now, reptiliomorphs include the biggest tetrapods of most of the Carboniferous. These would be animals that got up to be 3 meters long. That's a giant, you know, in the Carboniferous. And they also include, and this has already been mentioned, some of the earliest high fiber herbivores, which is an important part of my story today. The problem with them is we don't know what their mode of reproduction was, or we haven't really figured out. We assume all the amphibians had to return to water to reproduce as they do today, and we assume the reptiles did not. what the reptiliomorphs were doing. Were they laying amniotic eggs? Were they reproducing in water? This is not clear, simply because we don't have a fossil record of any of their eggs. Next slide. And then finally, the amniotes, like I said, they're known as reptiles, and Matt Stimson talked about this. Their oldest records are Bashkirian, both footprints and bones. And the biggest thing about reptiles, you see this in the upper right diagram, is this is an animal that's clearly more adapted to terrestrial locomotion than are most or all amphibians. It has a much more rigid and interlocking vertebral column. It has relatively larger limbs and limb girdles. So it's easy to look at early reptiles and as a first order approximation say, wow, this looks like a much more terrestrial animal than a lot of the contemporaneous amphibians. Next slide. So this is, to me, an important part of the story. We want to make a first order ecological distinction then, and it's not hard for some animals. If you look at the two animals on the right, I think it's pretty obvious. The critter in the upper right, it's a microsaur with a long body, tiny legs, big flattened tail for propulsion. This is obviously an aquatic animal. The animal on the lower right, though, which is a diadectomorph, looks a lot to me like a kind of monitor lizard in overall proportions, but whether or not it was in part amphibious, at least in its life cycle, this is a tricky thing to do. And so one of the things I'm going to argue is that I think that what the Kasimovian shows us is an increase in what I would call terrestrialization of the tetrapod fauna. You go from a more aquatic bunch of tetrapods to a more terrestrial, and therefore we have to be able to make these judgments, as squishy and inexact as they may be for some of the taxa. Next slide. Okay, let me talk about the overall Carboniferous tetrapod fossil record. It's not the best record. It's a record much inferior to the Permian or the Triassic record, both in terms of abundance, in terms of diversity. It's a record that's improved a lot. It's improving all the time with new discoveries. And one of the most important things is it's very scattered. And because it's scattered, it's never really been used to create its own biostratigraphy. This is a diagram Bob Carroll published. He actually published originally, I think in the 70s, a diagram like this. And then it was republished by him, by Jenny Clack and others, modifying, adding. But the bottom line is most of the vertebrate sites, tetrapod sites, are ordered using the plant biostratigraphy, which, to me has its ups and its downs, but it's pretty much as good as we've got at this point. Next slide. And here is the global distribution of Carboniferous tetrapod sites. And you see the site down in Australia, that's irrelevant here. That's a Visayan site. So all of the middle to late Pennsylvanian record of tetrapods is, we've seen this before with other taxa, is a Euro-American, it's a paleo-equatorial strip of localities that run basically from Arizona in the Western United States to the Czech Republic. That's what the record looks like. So it's not a global record. There's almost nothing known from Gondwana other than a Mississippian site in Australia. Next slide. The other problem is there aren't a lot of what I would call extensive assemblages, and by that I mean assemblages that have at least 10, say 5 or 10 genera. There's a lot of just isolated sites. There's definitely a bias towards what we might call wet habitats, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And really, there are only a handful of relatively diverse Carboniferous tetrapod sites. You see them, most of them listed here. And you'll also note that all of these sites are what would be called Westphalian in age. These big Carboniferous tetrapod faunas are Westphalian. There are no big Carboniferous tetrapod faunas in the later Pennsylvanian and the Stephanian interval. Most of them are all 4 or 5 taxa, if that. Next slide. And so I want to divide in my mind, in our mind, this Westphalian tetrapod fauna from a Stephanian fauna, just to use those plant-based terms, because that's the way the tetrapod assemblages are being correlated, and make the point that if you look at the Westphalian record, this is the classic coal swamp fauna. This is an old illustration. These are the aquatic amphibians and the like who are living in the coal forests, the coal swamps, whatever, of basically the middle Pennsylvania. Next slide. And, you know, just as an example of the probably one of the best sites of all in this interval is Linton in Ohio, which is an incredible site for the Carboniferous, over 1,000 tetrapod fossils and quite diverse. It comes from it's coal associated. Hook and Firm concluded it was accumulated in the fill of an abandoned channel. You see that on the lower right. And the thing you'll notice about it is it's almost totally dominated by temnospondyls and lepospondals. And if you go in and look at those animals, they're pretty much all aquatic. So this is a very aquatic assemblage of tetrapods here at Linton, which is late in the Westphalian. Next slide. And what I want to emphasize here, this is a diagram I published in '06. And what I was trying to do, some of you may know Emily Rayner wrote a classic paper in '71 about, in my mind, about how facies had a huge influence. In 1971, she was way ahead of the game here on tetrapod distribution. And I would modify this diagram a little, but the point is that you begin, or we begin in the middle Pennsylvanian and maybe earlier with these coal measures, tetrapod faunas. Red beds start to appear, and what ends up happening is that as we move into the Permian, we lose all those coal bed faunas, vertebrate faunas. We get into all these red bed faunas, and we also start to see, at least by middle Permian time, what I call the globalization of the tetrapod fauna, which to me, I guess globalization means you shop at Walmart, right? Isn't that what that means now? But this means you start to actually get a big record in Gondwana. So next slide. But let me give you a little more nuanced approach here. This comes from, some of you know, a very important paper that Behrensmeyer et al. Wrote in 2000, where they introduced the idea of taphonomic megabias. And I think when we look at the Carboniferous record, not just of the tetrapods, but also of the plants, the insects, everything we've been talking about, at least on land, there's a huge bias towards coal mining. The fact that you have these enormous open cast coal mines. This is a picture of one in Scotland. And what we get is a bias based on preservation. The preservation is preferential in these coal environments to preserve aquatic tetrapods. People are mining coal going way back in the 1800s. The miners are finding fossil bones, so we get a sampling bias. Everybody, the paleontologists like me, were drawn to where the fossils are being found. And therefore, the analysis is heavily biased towards the coal swamp tetrapods. And this is an important point because it really should chasten our ability to interpret the vertebrate record, the tetrapod record, because there are just so many more Westphalian tetrapods than there are Stephanian tetrapods, largely, I think, because of this bias. Next slide. Now, mind you, there are a couple, the bias isn't total. There are some oddball assemblages in the Westphalian, joggins in Eastern Canada, where we get a rather different assemblage. We get more terrestrial reptiles than we see in the coal swamp assemblages. The only problem with this is these are the famous coal swamp, the stump faunas, the animals who were, it's classic that Dawson and Charles Lyell studied way back 150 or more years ago in Nova Scotia, where these things are found in stumps. It was originally thought these silly reptiles fell into the stumps and died there, but we now know through the work of Matt Stimson and John Calder and other Canadians that some of these stumps had openings. They were actually houses where these little lizard-like animals were going in and out. But the point is, I don't know what quite to make of this. There is a terrestrial fauna. I see it as unusual because of this stump preservation. And what we really need is to find a terrestrial Westphalian assemblage in something that would not have been, coal swamp deposit or a stump. Next slide. So going back to an important paper Andrew Milner wrote in '87, there is this Westphalian chronofauna, if you will. And if you look at the list of families there and you knew all the different groups, almost all of these are pretty amphibious groups. There are some at least terrestrial animals perhaps in there, the earliest amniotes, etc. But this is the Westphalian chronofauna. It's dominated by aquatic amphibians. It's mostly coming from coals, seed earths, you know, deposits associated with coal mining. We know way more about it than any other Carboniferous tetrapods because of the megabias. And therefore, we have to keep that in mind when we interpret what's going to happen or what looks like happened in the Kasimovian. Next slide. Well, now let's go into the late Pennsylvanian, approximately the Stephanian, I'm calling it. Again, we have a geographically very widespread record. And interestingly, we have a number of Lagerstätten that have tetrapods in them, like Garnet, Howard, Kinney, Monsulemin, which maybe is Permian, according to some. But some of these assemblages, like let's say Kinney, and I'll talk about Kinney a little bit, and it's already been talked about. Kinney is a wet setting. It's a marine embayment. There are 4 amphibians known. They're aquatic amphibians, and they're endemic to the assemblage. So even though we move into the Kasimovian, we don't lose wet tetrapods. We just see them in selected environments. What I think is different is after the Westphalian, we start to see red bed assemblages, drier, if you will, tetrapod assemblages in different landscapes of different facies. Next slide. And so here, I showed this before. Here, Kinney is on the lower right, dark shales, huge flora. We just published, Bill and I just edited an entire like 500-page volume on Kinney. Some of the papers are up in the Dropbox. But then contrast it, go 200 kilometers north to the Canyon del Cobre in northern New Mexico, where probably the lower post part of this section is Missourian. We think some of the lower red beds are Gagelian. So this is almost Kasimovian, probably partly Kasimovian. And here we have red bed fluvial assemblages in the later Pennsylvanian, which, you know, if you looked at the rocks offhand, you'd think they were Permian. In fact, when the first pictures came back from the Mars rover, I remember telling Bill, isn't that a place? Aren't those red beds in West Texas? Doesn't the surface of Mars look like red beds in parts of Texas? But anyway, again, we have these microenvironments that remain wet, like Kinney. And what really happens in the Kasimovian is we start to see what can be very crudely called drier environments, floodplain, fluvial red beds, where we have different animals. And in this case, a high diversity of eupelicosaurs. And eupelicosaurs are all very much terrestrial amniotes. Next slide. Okay, so this is the Twitter version of Carboniferous tetrapod evolution, according to me. If you just wanted a one-slide summary of what happened to tetrapods in the Carboniferous, this is what happened. There were no big extinctions. They're restricted pretty much to Euramerica. I've talked about the Westphalian chronofauna. All these groups, these 3 big groups diversified. And then later in the Pennsylvanian, in the early Pennsylvanian, we get the origin of amniotes, and we'll see their diversification. And I'll talk about high fiber herbivory, which is an important innovation. Next slide. So what, you know, I used this phrase Kasimovian revolution in 2018 because I was trying to be perhaps too clever or sensational. And we've seen this diagram. There's the big change in vegetation. And maybe there's a change in climate. There ought to be a change in the tetrapods, right? I mean, I said this earlier, tetrapods change when food changes. So if the food changes, the plant food changes, that might change the herbivores. And if the herbivores change, the carnivores will change, and so on. Next slide. Well, indeed, one of the big things that happens is the appearance of a large number of new taxa, new families listed here of tetrapods in the late Pennsylvanian. Okay, and if you look at this group, the amphibian groups, the Eriopids, Trimerex, those are thought of as relatively terrestrial amphibians, the Diadectids, Diadectomorphs, and then we have the reptile or amniote groups to follow. So the big thing here is you're getting all this, and I call it a terrestrialization of the tetrapod assemblage. The problem is that most of the real records of these things, the oldest records, are Gagelian. They're not older than Gagelian. The reality is there are very few demonstrably Kasimovian tetrapod sites on the planet. Most of the late Pennsylvanian sites that are well dated appear to be Gagelian. So, you know, on this diagram from Modesto, of course, where you do the cladistics, you can get these ghost lineages, and you can see that some of these groups must have been around before their lowest occurrences. But the fact is that's when their lowest occurrences are, mostly Gagelian. Next slide. Let's look at diversity dynamics. Okay, the Sani et al. Paper in 10 is the one by Sani and Mike Benton and Howard Falcon Lang that pitched this term Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Well, they claimed that tetrapod diversity increased. You can see that dashed line right through the Kasimovian into the Permian. But later, Dunne et al. Did a subsequent analysis in 18 showing a substantial drop in tetrapod diversity into the Kasimovian. Well, I have a paper in press that reviews the Carboniferous record of tetrapods. And so my numbers upper right, in the upper right in red, those are my generic numbers. And they show a decrease in diversity as well. So I think the Dunne analysis is much more realistic. Now, what does this mean? I'm intrigued. I saw Yukun Shi the other day showing us a drop in marine diversity, at least in the Chinese record in the Kasimovian. I'm worried that this drop in tetrapod diversity may be more a reflection of rock volume, number of localities. I'm not sure it's a real drop, I guess is what I'm saying. I think we can agree now, we can reject the Sani et al. Claims. I think what Dunne et al. Have published is quite correct. Like I said, my analysis agrees. But what does the apparent drop in tetrapod diversity going into the Kasimovian mean? And isn't it just maybe a side effect of this taphonomic megabias, where we have these, big sites like Linton in the Moscovian Westphalian interval, and then we lose diversity? Next slide. There's been little effort to study morphological disparity changes in Carboniferous tetrapods. One of the few studies is this one on the lower left by Brocklehurst and Brink, who showed that there was a big jump in pelycosaur body size during the later Pennsylvanian, which is, body size is a big deal, and it's one measure of disparity. The fact that all these pelycosaur groups you see on the right, all those groups appeared in the late Pennsylvanian. That's a pretty disparate bunch of critters. I mean, that Adaphosaur second down, that's a herbivore. So even though it has a sail like the Dimetrodon at the bottom, which it's a predator. So one of the things you can say is, one of the first kind of back of the envelope ways to look at disparity is just to say how many higher taxa are appearing, because higher taxa are more disparate. And you've got all these families appearing in the late Pennsylvanian. So to me, that's a measure of a big jump in disparity, but more needs to be done here. Next slide. Okay, adaptive breakthroughs. I'm just going to focus on one, which is that we've talked about already, the appearance of high fiber herbivory. The thinking is, it's not easy to eat plant material. All those insects that were that Mike Donovan was talking about, they all had to evolve some way to digest cellulose and other tough to consume plant matter. Well, tetrapods had to do the same. So the thinking is whatever tetrapod herbivory existed before the late Pennsylvanian was pretty much detritivores. Its high fiber herbivory appears late in the Pennsylvanian. It appears in 4 different clades, 4 different types of tetrapods. And you see there's a phylogeny on the right, and you can sort of sense, you see the green area at the bottom, you can see that these clades are all beginning in the late Pennsylvanian, and of course they all diversify into the Permian. And the thinking is, looking at the diadectomorph on the bottom right, is that these animals had evolved some sort of hindgut fermentation, some way to break down cellulose. That's why they had these long, abdominal regions, et cetera. But the high fiber herbivory, how do we know that? We judge it from their dentitions, from the evolution of closely interlocking, grinding type of tooth sets that suggest these animals were consuming and really chewing up plants. But as we've mentioned, the wild card in the story is there are older footprints of possible high fiber herbivores. I doubt it. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody could explain to me why in the Bashkirian high fiber herbivory would have evolved. I like it as something that happens in the later Pennsylvanian. And that would be a direct response to vegetational change. Next slide. The other thing, and I've alluded to this, is amniotes, reptiles, as I always call them reptiles. I hate calling them amniotes. Reptiles appeared in the early Pennsylvanian. Matt showed the footprints, the bones that come from places like Joggins, et cetera. But they really begin to diversify later in the Pennsylvanian. They're around in the early Pennsylvanian, and it's in the late Pennsylvanian. These are a couple of phylogenies that Mike Benton published, and you don't have to read them. You can just see that the reptile clades are expanding, are increasing in number as in the late Pennsylvanian. And then I mentioned the problem, of course, is when did this diversification really begin? Most of the actual lowest occurrences, LOs, that we can well date are Gagelian. But again, some of the ghost lineages indicate it must go back further. So we're seeing this diversification of amniotes at a first order simple approach. These are all pretty much terrestrial animals. And of course, you go back to Everett Olson's work, who really pointed out that the first truly terrestrial communities of tetrapods appeared in the early Permian. And by that, he meant the first communities in which terrestrial tetrapod predators fed on terrestrial tetrapod herbivores. They did not return to the water to eat. And we think a lot of the predators certainly before the late Pennsylvanian, mostly were hunting in and around the water. Next slide. So what does this all mean? Why are we talking about this? Here's what I think we can walk away from. This is the take-home message to me. We've got to remember that we're looking at not the best record. This is not the Chinese record of marine diversity. It's a very patchy record. It's got a lot of problems with debate, with dating, et cetera. But we also have this big taphonomic megabias. That's a filter that we have to think about when we go from this huge Westphalian record into this less extensive Stephanian record. There are no mass extinctions. There's no apparent, at least right now, there's no sudden synchronous appearance of everything. But I think there's very strong, clear evidence that the tetrapod fauna changes substantially. It's terrestrializing. It's going from a more aquatic fauna, and the aquatics are still around. Like I said, Kinney's a good example. You still have these aquatic amphibians in the right environment. But what you didn't have before the late Pennsylvanian are animals like the ones you see here, the fully terrestrial, predatory, and high fiber herbivory that appeared in the late Pennsylvanian. Next slide. So, was there a Kasimovian revolution, or was it just a transition? That's the question I think we should all ask, really, about everything we've been talking about here. I mean, it seems to me that we're talking about a very complex change in the Earth system and in these Earth's biota that doesn't look like one big event. That's why it's never gotten the play that, say, the end Permian extinction gets. But it is an important change in the tetrapod assemblages. All right, well, that's all I have to say. Thank you. Open for questions.
Thanks a lot, Spencer. Again, what for me to absorb there and learn. Do we have any questions? Nothing has shown up so far. I can ask an opening question. So of all those animals, looking at the head sizes on that one group you showed, one might think that Adaphosors weren't very smart. Do you have any thoughts about brain size evolution and its relationship to habitats of these animals? Like, what's the smartest animal in the Kasimovian on Earth?
Well, you got to be careful here. I mean, it's kind of like, poor Stegosaurus, who had a walnut-sized brain and was stupid, and yet it survived for tens of millions of years. Adaphosors, I mean, I always say, you only need as much brain as you need. And, so Adaphosors had small heads. They were herbivores. All those other pelycosaurs have these big heads with large, sharp teeth. I'm not sure their brains are any bigger or smaller than Adaphosors. And so I don't know the answer to your question. I'm not sure anybody's really looked much at pelycosaur brain size. It probably has been discussed, but I've never heard anything significant thought about tetrapod brain size in the Carboniferous or even into the Permian. Where you start to get into the discussion of that is when you start to look at dinosaurs and whatnot in the Mesozoic. And then there's a lot of interest in, particularly when you're talking about the origin of birds and things like that, because somewhere along the line, you've got to get greater encephalization. But back in the Permian, I mean, life was good. and you were just as smart as you needed to be. I mean, a Dilophosaur had to be smart enough to to hunt down a calamite or a pteridosperm or whatever they were eating, right?
I was on a tour one time, and a student asked one of our dinosaur people about a Stegosaurus brain. We had a Triceratops brain. We had a skull cut down the middle, and you could see the brain was about that big. And they asked you, "What's this?" And the answer was somewhat like what you just said. What questions does it have to ask? Can it eat me, or is it going to try to eat me, or can I eat it? And is it going to try to mate with me, or should I try to mate with it? Am I awake or am I asleep? And that's about your life.
Well, let me tell you something too that not everybody knows, but I went to the grocery store years ago and I bought some walnuts. And the brain size of Stegosaurus is known, it's estimated. And I figured out that the brain of Stegosaurus is actually the size of 2 walnuts. So that animal has been seriously maligned for decades.
Okay.
I mean, it didn't have 1 walnut-sized brain, it had 2 walnuts.
As far as the sampling goes, it strikes me that they're out there. I remember walking along a road cut in West Virginia. I can't remember if it's Route 9 or 19 or something like that, but it runs along the river when you cross over from to Ohio. It might have been on the Ohio side. And there was a skeleton laying on the ground. And I think we collected it, and Dave Berman described it, I believe. Mm-hmm. But it had fallen out somewhere from late Pennsylvanian strata in a limestone. And I think Ron talked a little bit about some of those. Some of those limestones have mud cracks in them and all that kind of thing. So you wonder if we're just not looking, like you said, because there's nobody's making the exposure for us.
Yeah, there's an interesting, Berman and others wrote a paper a few years ago about an amphibian, a skull that was found in the Appalachian Basin that they named FedExia after FedEx, the company.
Because I think they saw.
And that paper is well worth reading. I'm sure Ron is familiar, because the Appalachian Basin is a perfect microcosm of what I'm talking about. In the Appalachian Basin, you go from sites like Linton, in 5 Points, where you've got this totally aquatic fauna. Everybody's, and it's all associated with coal. And then as you move up into the Conemaugh, the Monongahela, and the Dunkard, you see a big change in the tetrapod fauna, where you start to see these other animals. I think the skeleton you probably found was of an Dilophosaur. I remember that Dave Berman wrote a paper on an Dilophosaur from there. And so the question I would ask is, and I just said it, I think the Appalachian Basin record is a microcosm of the change in the tetrapod fauna, but I don't have a lot of other places where I have that good of a record, going from the Westphalian megabias, if you will, into the Stephanian, more terrestrialized fauna. But that really is perhaps the template for understanding tetrapod evolution across the mid-late Pennsylvanian boundary.
Ron Martino has a question. Ron, if you want to light up and unmute, here we go.
Yeah, just a curiosity, really. Ariops have pretty prevalent in the late Pennsylvanian and got even bigger in the Permian. Regarding its diet, do you think it's conceivable that Ariops would include in its diet the arthropleurids?
Yeah, why not? I mean, Ariops looks like a voracious predator, a generalized predator. It's a Temnospondyli with relatively big limbs, at least in the adult. We don't know much about the juvenile. It looks like a terrestrial hunter. The problem you have to worry about with these critters is they may have been terrestrial and still gone back, kind of like crocodiles did, and fed along water courses. But yeah, why not have Ariops killing arthropleurids?
Yeah, I mean, some of the arthropleurids were probably as big, if not even bigger, than the Ariops. So
yeah, and Jorg knows more about this than me, but I'm remembering in the literature, there are those who suggest the arthropleurids were out hunting the tetrapods. Maybe not the Ariops, but the smaller tetrapods. Am I right? Hasn't that been thrown out there, Jorg?
I assume arthropleura may overcome Ariops, especially juveniles. Interestingly, track occurrences and skeleton occurrences of Eriops have often body remains of Arthropleura or the trails of Arthropleura. There is any relation.
So there's an Eriops Arthropleura association, you're saying?
Yeah.
So then the question becomes who was thumping on who, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, now,
there's a reconstruction by Steve Gribb in the Arthropleura trackways and the Limnopus trackways that we had from presumably Areopoid amphibians in Eastern Kentucky. And at the end of that 2009 Journal of Paleo article, Steve put together an interesting picture of the Areopoid amphibian stalking this arthropleurid that was probably bigger than he was. So, I mean, we're speculating. They're both found on the same bedding plane. And so there seemed to be some, spatial relation and temporal relationship there, but we don't really know who was after who.
Right, but the important point, and this plays into the whole discussion, is that you would not find that, I would argue, in the Westphalian. This is terrestrial predation. Whether it's the Eriops hunting the Arthropleura or vice versa, this kind of terrestrial predator-prey interaction must have become more common in the late Pennsylvanian than it was in the Westphalian, where probably most tetrapod feeding was going on in the water or right around the margins. So I think it's an important observation that you're getting, even if it's circumstantial, because the tracks at most are circumstantial evidence of association. But I would argue that plays into the point.
Matt, you have a comment? Matt Stimson, you're muted there.
Yeah, at Joggins, we see Arthropleura tracks and Nodulacerta and as well as smaller Batrachichnus, small Limnopus tracks. We haven't really came to that conclusion. One sample that really sticks out in my mind, we saw this beautiful Arthropleura trackway crossing a slab, Nodulacerta going right down the middle of the Arthropleura track, and then the Nodulacerta reptile track veers off the side of the track and then disappears off the slab. So we haven't made the association of predation, but they're certainly running around at the same time.
Yeah.
But that,
well, again,
association of tetrapod is
right.
close.
And again, that's Nodulacerta is the track of an early reptile associated with the track of a very big terrestrial, arthropod. And again, that association, I don't think could have happened in the Westphalian in older rocks necessarily. At least not as common as it might have occurred in the later Pennsylvanian. Although I think it's occurring in the early Pennsylvanian, isn't it? There in Joggins.
Yeah, that's right. We have it at Westphalian A. Almost every surface, not every surface, but almost every surface, or at least every horizon that we have Arthropleura tracks, we have tetrapod tracks associated.
The problem with all of this, and I wrote a paper with Adrian Hunt about this years ago, and others have too, where we looked at, what is the evidence for predation, say in Paleozoic trackways, and most of it's pretty difficult. So you got two animals trackways and one disappears. What does that mean? Does it mean, a lot of times, and you'll find this in literature, people conclude this animal ate the one that disappeared. But in reality, if you look closely, it's just that the track surface changed, it wasn't preserved, something like that. There's not a lot of conclusive predator-prey interaction data in the Carboniferous trace fossil record. It's a difficult. And really, if you look at the bigger record of dinosaur footprints, which is a huge record compared to this, there's almost no evidence of predator-prey. There have been a couple of cases like at Glen Rose in Texas where it's thought a sauropod was being tracked and attacked by a theropod dinosaur. But the evidence for this is really hard to come by.